Sarah Lowry's breath came out in short, painful bursts, misting the frigid air around her. Her hands were stiff fingers frozen against the iron bars that confined her, the bitter cold crawling into her bones like a slow, steady ache. 4 days. She'd been here for 4 days, locked in a cage at the center of Miller's Ridge. The townsfolk passed by, indifferent to her suffering, as though she were some stray animal not worth a second glance. They didn't even pretend to be concerned. Her cheeks burned from the tears that had long since frozen to her skin, the last of her tears now mingled with the dirt that stuck to her face. She had begged, no pleaded for help when she was first thrown into this cage, but no one had listened. The town had decided she was a criminal, a beggar, and the sheriff had taken it upon himself to teach her a lesson. No trial, no defense, just a locked cage and the cold, merciless sky above. The snow underfoot crunched with each passing step of a townsperson, each footfall a reminder of how far away she felt from the life she had once known. She had been a seamstress in Denver, a woman with a life, a future. But that had been before Silas Crenshaw had decided to use her as his property, before the judge sentenced her to a life of indentured servitude that lasted 2 long years. She had escaped him, barely running, without a plan, only to find herself in this town, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of fear. A sharp sting of cold cut through her thin dress, drawing her back to the present. Her legs felt like lead beneath her, the pain of being locked in this cage, trapped by the cruelty of it all, beginning to wear her down in ways she hadn't expected. She had known hunger before, had known the gnawing ache of an empty stomach. But this was different. She wasn't just hungry. She was becoming a part of the landscape, an invisible thing to be forgotten, like the brittle snow she saw in the distance, destined to be trampled by boots buried in the cold. Her vision blurred. She was slipping, fading, losing track of time, of thoughts, of everything but the cold. "Hey, vagrant!" The shout sliced through the numbness, snapping Sarah back to the present. She turned her head, but it took effort. Her body protested every movement. The group of boys stood near the edge of the square, snowballs in their hands, their laughter like a razor through her soul. They threw them at her one after another, each impact a bitter reminder that this was her life now. She didn't even flinch when the snowballs hit her face. The ice stung, but she had long since stopped caring. She had learned how to disappear into the cold, into the background of the town, into the shadows where no one could see her. They were throwing the snowballs for fun, and she was nothing more than an object, a target. 12 snowballs. The boys grew bored and wandered off, leaving Sarah alone again, the sting of the ice still biting her skin, but the laughter of the children fading into the distance. It was the silence, the emptiness of it all, that hurt the most. She tried to focus on the sun, weak and pale behind the gray clouds. When it reached the mountain, the temperature would drop again. It would get worse. The cold was relentless here. And then she heard something, a sound that made her blood freeze. A wagon. It wasn't like any other wagon that had passed by. This one was slow, steady, and it stopped. Her eyes flickered open, but she wasn't sure if her mind was playing tricks on her. People had passed before, seen her, mocked her, but no one had stopped. But this wagon, it didn't just pass. The children there were voices, high-pitched, curious. "Papa, look at that. Papa, why is that lady in the cage?" Sarah forced her head up from the cold metal bars and blinked, trying to clear the fog from her vision. She could barely make out the figures moving in front of the wagon, 2 girls, maybe more. But it was the man walking toward her that caught her attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face, tired eyes, dark hair streaked with gray. He walked toward her with a quiet determination, each step crunching softly in the snow. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, but it carried. How long have you been here?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was too dry. She swallowed the roughness of her voice, scraping like sandpaper. 4 days, she whispered, barely able to hear herself. She tried again. 4 days. The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't speak. His eyes moved to the sheriff standing off to the side, leaning against the post. Sarah saw Sheriff Bradford's sneer and felt her stomach twist. "You're the one who put her here." The man's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. He wasn't asking a question, he was making a statement. "Sure am," Bradford replied, his voice dripping with a mix of contempt and amusement. "Caught her begging. She's nothing but trash." The man's eyes hardened as he turned to face the sheriff, but he didn't respond to his words. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of bills. "How much to let her out?" His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of it. Bradford blinked, taken aback for a moment. "What? How much to open the cage and let her walk out?" The man repeated, his eyes never leaving Bradford's. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy like the snow pressing down on the town. The sheriff stared at the man, looking like he might laugh, but then his gaze flickered to the money in the man's hand. $20, Bradford spat. "You want to buy yourself a vagrant?" The man didn't blink. $20. Open the cage. The crowd around them began to shift, whispers starting to circulate. Some seemed curious, others disgusted, but all were watching. The man's eyes never left the sheriff's face, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Bradford's fingers twitched at his side, his grip tightening on his gun. But the man wasn't flinching. He was standing firm, unwavering. Finally, Bradford cursed under his breath and yanked the keys from his belt. "Fine," he snarled. "Take her. But when she robs you blind, don't come crying to me." The sheriff stormed over to the cage, his boots heavy against the snow, and shoved the key into the lock. With a violent twist, he threw the door open. Sarah's legs buckled beneath her when the door swung open. She tried to move, but her body didn't respond. Her muscles had stiffened, numbed by the days of exposure. She couldn't stand, couldn't walk, couldn't even lift her head. But before she could fall, the man Caleb McCraw was there. His arms swept around her with surprising strength, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice low and steady, almost like a promise. Sarah didn't have the strength to protest. She closed her eyes, the warmth of his body pressing against hers, a stark contrast to the cold she had just endured. "You're safe now," he said again, but Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't say anything at all. She simply let herself lean into him, the weight of her body finally yielding to something, someone who might be able to change her life. He didn't say much, but when Caleb McCraw took her into his arms, she realized the cage wasn't the only prison she had to escape. Caleb McCraw's arms were strong but gentle as he cradled Sarah, his body a comforting warmth in the bitter cold. For a moment, she couldn't remember if she had ever felt such warmth. Her head rested against his chest, and she could hear the steady beat of his heart beneath his coat. It was a sound she hadn't realized she was craving until now, as if it could erase the cold that had settled into her very bones. She wanted to thank him, wanted to say something, anything, but her voice was lost, buried somewhere deep inside her. She hadn't spoken much in days, too afraid that her words would break under the weight of everything that had happened. The days in the cage had stolen more than just her strength, they had stolen her voice. But Caleb didn't seem to expect anything. He just carried her toward the wagon, his steps sure and unwavering. The wagon, which had been standing silent in the cold, now seemed to take on a new purpose. It wasn't just a vehicle to take them from one place to another. It was a vessel that would carry her out of this place of cruelty, out of the cage she had been trapped in, both physically and mentally. His daughters were already waiting in the back of the wagon, watching them closely. Sarah could see the worry in their eyes that should have been filled with joy and innocence, not with the burden of fear and concern for a stranger. She wanted to tell them that she would be okay, but again, the words wouldn't come. She could barely keep her own thoughts together, let alone give them comfort. The youngest of the girls, Maggie, slid over to make room for Sarah, her small hands nervously fidgeting with the woolen blanket that covered the seat. The other girls, Alice and Evelyn, whispered among themselves, but it was clear that their attention was still on Sarah, who was now settled between them, wrapped in the blankets they had hurriedly placed around her. Caleb climbed into the wagon after her settling next to her, his large frame taking up more space than she was used to. The wagon creaked beneath their weight as he adjusted himself, turning to face her with an expression that was both kind and filled with an unreadable sadness. She looked at him, unsure of how to react to the man who had so easily become her lifeline. She had known nothing but fear and betrayal for so long. It was hard to imagine that anyone would willingly help her. "What's your name?" Alice asked, her voice soft but curious. "Sarah." She whispered the word, feeling foreign on her tongue. It had been so long since anyone had asked her who she was, since she had been allowed to be anything other than a victim, anything other than the woman in the cage. "Sarah, I'm Alice," the girl replied, giving her a shy smile. "This is Evelyn and Maggie," she added, pointing to her sisters in turn. Sarah gave a small nod, unsure of what else to say. The girls had no reason to trust her, no reason to care, but they had given her that trust without hesitation, like they had somehow known she wasn't a threat. Perhaps they saw her for what she truly was, a woman who had been broken but not yet beaten. Caleb turned his attention to the road ahead, his jaw tightening as the wagon began to move. The horses' hooves crunched over the snow, the wheels turning with a steady rhythm that seemed to mirror the heartbeat that had once again begun to steady in Sarah's chest. She hadn't noticed how deeply the cold had gotten into her until now, until she felt the warmth of the wagon slowly start to melt the numbness that had gripped her limbs. Slowly, her body began to respond, and with it came the realization that she was no longer in that cage. She wasn't bound by the metal bars, the cold wind, or the cruel people who had watched her suffer. She was free. But as the words echoed through her mind, Sarah couldn't quite believe them. Freedom was not something she had known for a long time, and it was hard to reconcile the idea with the reality of her life. She had spent too long running from one prison to the next, first in Denver, under Crenshaw's control, then in the streets, and now in Miller's Ridge. Each time she thought she had escaped, something had always dragged her back. The wagon rumbled on, and she let her thoughts wander, not sure where else to turn. The weight of the past still lingered like a dark cloud, one she wasn't sure how to shake. But in this moment, in the warmth of the wagon, surrounded by the kindness of strangers, she began to wonder if just maybe she could start again. Caleb's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You'll be safe with us. I promise you that." Sarah turned toward him, surprised by the force of his words. His eyes were steady, filled with a quiet strength that made her want to believe him even when she wasn't sure if she could believe anything at all. "I don't have much to offer." He continued, his tone softening. "But I can give you a roof over your head and a place to rest. That's all I can do right now." Sarah swallowed hard, the lump in her throat, refusing to budge. She wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him how much this meant to her, but the words remained locked inside her. Instead, she nodded and managed the smallest of smiles, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, but was enough for Caleb to see that she was beginning to trust him, if only a little. The wagon creaked as they moved through the town, passing by the few remaining souls in the streets. Sarah kept her eyes forward, not daring to look back at the place that had nearly destroyed her. She didn't know where they were headed, but for the first time in days, she felt like there was a chance, a real chance, for something better. As they left Miller's Ridge behind, Caleb turned the wagon toward the foothills, the snow-capped mountains rising in the distance. The scenery was different here, untamed, wild, but beautiful in its own way. It reminded her of the life she had once dreamed of before everything had gone wrong. A life she had almost forgotten. It was cold, but the wind didn't bite here the way it had in town. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and fresh snow, and for the first time Sarah felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years. "Oh, where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a cabin," Caleb said, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "It's not much, but it's enough for now. It's not far." The wagon continued its slow journey, the sound of the horses' hooves steady and soothing. Caleb's daughters had quieted, sensing the shift in the air, as if they too were aware that something was changing. For all the pain and loss that had led them here, something new was beginning. And though Sarah wasn't sure she believed in second chances, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine it. Sarah didn't know it yet, but the warmth of the cabin was only the beginning. The real healing would come from a family who didn't know how to give up. The wagon rattled over the rough trail, the horses' hooves crunching through the snow as the wind howled in their wake. Sarah sat huddled between Caleb's daughters, the warmth of the blankets surrounding her, almost as comforting as the quiet chatter of the girls. Caleb drove the wagon with his usual steady hand, the reins held firmly, his eyes scanning the path ahead. They had been traveling for hours, the landscape around them growing wilder, more isolated. The town of Miller's Ridge had long since disappeared behind them, and now the towering snow-covered peaks of the Rockies stood as silent sentinels on either side. For Sarah, the journey felt like a dream. The rhythmic motion of the wagon, the soft murmur of the wind, and the distant sounds of the girls' laughter were all so unfamiliar. The world around her felt foreign in the most peaceful way possible. She was no longer confined by iron bars or the hateful eyes of the townsfolk. The shackles that had bound her for so long were gone, and with them the weight of her past began to lift, even if only a little. As the wagon crested a hill, Caleb slowed the horses. The cabin came into view, a modest structure nestled against a grove of pines, smoke curling from the chimney. It looked like something from a dream, small but sturdy with a welcoming feel. The kind of place that promised safety and warmth, the kind of place she had almost forgotten could exist. "Here we are," Caleb said, his voice steady and calm as always, though Sarah could sense a quiet relief in it. The girls stirred beside her, eager for the stop, and Caleb guided the wagon toward the wooden platform that served as a porch. As the wagon came to a halt, Sarah felt her heart quicken, a mix of gratitude and uncertainty filling her chest. Caleb climbed down from the wagon, moving with a fluid grace that belied his size, and he turned to Sarah. "Can you walk, or would you prefer I help you?" The offer was gentle, not demanding, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt herself hesitate. She wanted to be strong, to stand on her own 2 feet, but her legs were still stiff from the cold. Her body hadn't fully recovered from the brutal confinement, and though she had fought to hold herself together, the weight of everything she had endured was still pressing on her. I think I'll need help," she admitted, her voice soft, barely more than a whisper. Without hesitation, Caleb reached up, offering her his hand. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before accepting it, feeling the warmth of his rough, calloused palm envelop her fragile one. With his support, she carefully stepped down from the wagon and onto the soft earth, her legs trembling beneath her. "Take it slow," Caleb advised, his voice kind but firm. You've been through more than anyone should have to." The words were simple, but they hit Sarah like a hammer to the chest. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, not with understanding, not with compassion. She had been called many things, weak, useless, even worthless, but never had someone acknowledged the weight she carried in such a quiet, unspoken way. The girls hopped out of the wagon with a collective sigh, eager to stretch their legs. Maggie ran ahead, her boots crunching in the snow as she approached the cabin door. Alice and Evelyn followed, their laughter ringing out as they playfully jostled each other. Caleb watched them for a moment, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips, before he turned back to Sarah. "You'll be warm in no time." "I'll get a fire going," he said, his eyes kind but steady. "The girls can help you settle in." Sarah nodded, unsure of what to say. She didn't belong here, didn't belong with these people who had already given her so much. She was a stranger to them, a woman with a past that no one should have to carry. But as Caleb moved toward the firewood pile, Sarah couldn't help but feel the smallest spark of hope ignite in her chest. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit her immediately, wrapping around her like a blanket. The fire Caleb started crackled in the stone hearth, its golden light flickering across the room. The walls of the cabin were simple but inviting, decorated with small touches, a hand-woven rug, a few family pictures, a table with mismatched chairs. It wasn't much, but it felt like home. Maggie, ever the curious one, hovered near Sarah, her big brown eyes wide with innocence. "Are you hungry? Papa makes the best stew." Sarah couldn't help but smile at the girl's enthusiasm. "I'm starving," she replied, her voice gaining strength with the words. The hunger that had gnawed at her for so long began to feel less overwhelming. She could smell the rich scent of the stew cooking, and for the first time in days her stomach growled in response. "Sit by the fire," Alice said, leading Sarah to one of the chairs near the hearth. "You'll feel better once you're warm." Sarah lowered herself carefully into the chair, the warmth from the fire already working its way into her tired muscles. Her eyes flickered to Caleb, who had already begun to prepare the meal, his movements efficient, but easy as if he had done this 1,000 times. The girls chattered around her, and though Sarah wasn't yet ready to fully join in their conversation, she felt something within her start to shift. It was the smallest thing, a flicker of hope, a spark of something long forgotten, but it was there. She was starting to believe she could heal here, that this could be the beginning of something new. After a few moments, Caleb placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of her. "Eat," he said simply before turning to tend to the fire again. There was no pressure, no judgment in his tone, just a quiet, understanding command. Sarah took the spoon and dipped it into the stew, the warmth of the food filling her in ways that nothing else could. The flavors were simple: potatoes, carrots, onions, but it was the comfort of it, the care that went into making it, that made her feel like she might survive this. As she ate, the girls continued to talk their words, a pleasant hum in the background. Sarah listened to them with half an ear, lost in the simple act of eating, of feeling full. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this way, safe, cared for, and nourished. The weight of the cage, of Miller's Ridge, of everything she had escaped, seemed to fade with each bite. "Papa's right," Maggie said suddenly, interrupting Sarah's thoughts. "We're all going to be okay here." Sarah's heart gave a small, painful lurch. She wasn't sure if she could believe in that. Okay. The word seemed foreign to her, like it belonged to a life she hadn't known in so long. Could she really believe in a future like this? But as Caleb's eyes met hers across the room, his expression steady and unwavering, she felt a flicker of something deep inside her. Maybe okay was possible. "I hope so." Sarah whispered, her voice almost lost in the sound of the fire crackling. "I really do." Caleb didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the fire, tending to it, with the care of someone who had lived a life of hard work and quiet patience. But Sarah could feel the weight of his words in the air, his silent promise to her that she wouldn't have to face this alone. In this cabin with these people, she wasn't just a victim anymore. She was part of something that was still fragile, still new, but real. And for the first time in so long, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of a life she could build for herself. When the past calls, it doesn't knock, it demands to be heard. And for Sarah, the worst of her past was already on its way. The morning sun had barely crested over the mountain, casting a soft golden light across the cabin as Sarah sat by the fire. The warmth of it felt good against her skin, but there was a tightness in her chest she couldn't shake. It had been 2 days since she had arrived at Caleb's cabin, and the constant hum of domestic life was starting to settle into her bones. It was a strange feeling, this quiet peace. The warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of Caleb chopping wood outside the laughter of his daughters as they went about their chores. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to relax, to let go of the constant fear that had ruled her life for so long. But no matter how hard she tried to bury it, the past always had a way of rising to the surface like a storm on the horizon. As Sarah sat there staring into the fire, her thoughts drifted back to Denver, the years she had spent in Crenshaw's grip. She had been so young, naive when he had first laid eyes on her. She had thought she was safe in her little seamstress shop, safe with the money she made, until Silas Crenshaw had come knocking. He'd taken her under the guise of a business arrangement, offering her a job she could never have refused. The job had quickly turned into something much darker. She clenched her hands in her lap, her fingernails digging into the palms of her hands as the memories flooded her. She remembered the cold, the fear, the way Crenshaw's men had watched her every move. She remembered the feeling of being trapped with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The way she had felt when she first escaped, that desperate need to be free, to find anything that would give her a future. And now, after everything she'd been through, she had landed here on the edge of nowhere with a family who barely knew her, but still offered her refuge. Her stomach twisted with guilt. She should have known this wasn't the end. She should have known that leaving Crenshaw's reach wouldn't mean freedom. It was too good to be true. The thought of him finding her again sent a shiver down her spine, and she couldn't help but glance nervously out the window as if expecting him or his men to appear at any moment. The door creaked open, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. Caleb stepped inside, his face flushed from the cold, and his arms stacked with firewood. He glanced over at her, his eyes soft, like he could sense the weight she was carrying. "Something wrong?" he asked, setting the wood down by the fire. Sarah opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. She didn't want to burden him with her past. He had already done so much for her, given her so much. She couldn't bring herself to talk about the fear that still clung to her, the memory of the life she had escaped. "I'm fine," she said finally, her voice hoarse from disuse. Caleb raised an eyebrow, not fully believing her, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached for the kettle on the stove, filling it with water. "I thought I'd make some tea. You'll feel better once you get some warmth in you." Sarah nodded, grateful for the distraction, but the unease still lingered beneath the surface. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that her past was catching up with her. She had seen it in the way the girls had looked at her when she first arrived. Kindness, yes, but also a sort of wariness, as if they knew she wasn't quite the woman she seemed to be. She let out a shaky breath, trying to calm herself. She had to focus on the present. The girls, Caleb, this cabin. This was her chance to start over. She couldn't let the shadow of Crenshaw follow her forever. But no sooner had the thought crossed her mind than she heard it. A horse. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling fire, but as it drew closer, her stomach twisted. Her heart skipped a beat, and before she knew it, she was standing, her legs unsteady as she moved toward the window. Caleb must have heard it too, because he was beside her in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. "Stay inside," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "Don't worry." But Sarah couldn't help it. She couldn't just sit there, couldn't wait and pretend that everything was fine. She had lived too long under the threat of violence, the constant fear that someone was watching, waiting to pull her back into the life she had escaped. The sound of hooves grew louder, the crunch of snow underfoot growing nearer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her eyes scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of who it was. She saw nothing, but that didn't mean anything. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. Then the door slammed open, and a man stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was shadowed by the brim, but his eyes gleamed with a sharp, calculating intensity. Sarah's heart sank. The man didn't waste any time. His eyes locked on Sarah immediately, and a cold smile spread across his face. "You're still alive, then?" he said, his voice smooth but cold. The recognition hit Sarah like a punch in the stomach. She knew that voice. Liam Ross. He was one of Crenshaw's men. Her blood ran cold as he took a step toward her. Caleb moved between them instinctively, his body blocking Sarah from view, his stance protective and firm. "What do you want?" Caleb's voice was steady, but there was a warning in it. Liam smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm just here for the girl," he said, his eyes flickering over Sarah. "Crenshaw wants her back, and I'm not leaving without her." Sarah's breath hitched in her chest. It was happening. Her past had found her again. But Caleb didn't flinch. He stood tall, his body tense with a quiet rage, but there was no panic in him. "She's not going anywhere," he said firmly. "You tell Crenshaw I'll die before I let you take her." Liam's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Don't make me do this the hard way," he said, his tone deadly calm. The tension in the room thickened, heavy and suffocating. Sarah's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been running for so long, had thought she had escaped. But the past always had a way of catching up. And now it was here. The cold was still, but Caleb could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. No matter how far they ran, Crenshaw's men would never stop hunting. Liam Ross's presence in the cabin was like a heavy shadow, blocking out the warmth of the fire. The room seemed to shrink as his cold, calculating gaze moved over Sarah, then Caleb, and back again. Sarah stood frozen behind Caleb, her pulse hammering in her throat. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her like a predator assessing its prey. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "You won't take her." "Not while I'm standing here." Liam took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow as he entered the cabin fully. The door swung shut behind him with an ominous thud. He scanned the room, eyes lingering on the fire and the humble furnishings, as if he were deciding whether to rip the place apart or burn it down to the ground. His lips curled into a smirk, and his voice was a low, dangerous whisper. "You think you can stand against Crenshaw's men, a family of strangers hiding in the hills?" Sarah's heart clenched. Crenshaw. The name sent a shiver through her, as it always did. She had escaped him once, but she knew the price for that freedom. He would never stop hunting her. "He's not just a man, Caleb. He's a force." Sarah finally found her voice, and it shook as she spoke, betraying the fear she had tried so hard to bury. You don't understand. He won't let this go. He'll burn this place to the ground if he has to. Caleb glanced back at her, his expression softening, but his determination never wavered. You're under my protection now. I'll make sure of it. Liam's smirk only deepened as he pulled something from his coat pocket, a letter sealed with wax bearing Crenshaw's insignia. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't have to. The letter was enough. This is your last warning. Liam said, his eyes never leaving Sarah. Come back to him willingly, and you can avoid what's coming. If not, well, Crenshaw's not a man who likes to leave things unfinished. Caleb stepped forward, his boots solid against the wooden floor, and his chest puffed with quiet authority. You think I'm afraid of Crenshaw? You're not taking her, and I'll make sure of that. Liam took a step closer to Caleb, his face now inches from his. You're a fool if you think you can fight this. No one stands against Crenshaw. He'll have you all dead before the sun sets. The threat hung in the air, a sickening, palpable weight. Sarah felt it, the sense of inevitability creeping up her spine. She had no illusions about the danger they were in. Crenshaw's men were merciless. He wouldn't just stop at taking her, he would make an example of anyone who got in his way. She looked around the room at the faces of Caleb's daughters, their eyes wide with fear but filled with hope. They had no idea what they were up against. They had no idea what Crenshaw was capable of. But Caleb was different. He wasn't like the men who had imprisoned her, who had used her for their own gain. He wasn't like Crenshaw. Caleb wasn't afraid. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, Caleb broke it, his voice cutting through the tension. You'll leave now. Take your threats back to Crenshaw. I won't let you put my family in danger. Liam's smirk faltered, and for a split second Sarah thought she saw something like doubt in his eyes. He was used to being in control, used to people cowering under the weight of Crenshaw's power. But Caleb wasn't cowering. Caleb was standing tall, unafraid. Liam's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to Caleb. He was sizing him up, calculating his options. The power struggle was evident, but it was Caleb who held the upper hand. Slowly, Liam straightened, though his eyes never left Caleb. Consider this your only warning. Liam said, his voice colder now. Crenshaw doesn't take kindly to being defied. Caleb didn't respond. He just held Liam's gaze, his stance unwavering. And without another word, Liam turned on his heel and walked to the door. As he passed Sarah, he paused, his eyes locking onto hers with a malicious gleam. You'll regret this, he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. Then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. The sound echoed in the stillness, and Sarah let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a long moment, no one spoke. Caleb stood frozen in the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The girls were silent, their wide eyes locked on him, their fear still hanging in the air. Finally, Caleb turned to Sarah, his face drawn tight with concern. Are you all right? Sarah nodded, though her hands were trembling. I'm fine. She wasn't fine. She was anything but fine. The weight of what had just happened was heavy in her chest. The knowledge that Crenshaw would come for her, would come for all of them, was a bitter truth that she couldn't escape. Caleb's eyes softened, and he moved toward the fire, adding another log to the flames. The heat from the fire filled the room, but it did little to soothe the cold dread settling in Sarah's bones. Caleb said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. You don't have to face this alone. We'll fight with you. The sincerity in his voice stirred something inside her, something that had long since been buried. She hadn't known what it felt like to be truly cared for, to be protected. She had always been on her own, running, hiding, surviving. But here with Caleb, with his daughters, she was learning what it meant to belong. "I don't want to drag you into this," she said, her voice shaking. "This is my fight, not yours." Caleb shook his head, his jaw setting with resolve. "You're part of this family now. We fight together." His words were simple, but they were all she needed to hear. For the first time in so long, Sarah felt like she had a place to stand. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was part of something, a family who would fight for her no matter what. "I'll stay," she whispered, the decision settling deep inside her. She didn't know how they would fight Crenshaw or his men, but she wasn't running anymore. Not now, not after everything. Caleb smiled, and there was something in his eyes that Sarah hadn't expected, a quiet confidence, a belief that they could face this storm together and come out the other side. "We'll make sure you're safe," he promised, his voice steady. Outside the wind howled, but inside the cabin the fire crackled warm and strong. The storm was coming, but Sarah wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in years she believed they might actually survive it. When the past arrives, it does not ask for permission, it demands retribution. And for Sarah, the worst of her past was already on its way. The morning was quiet, too quiet. The wind had settled, leaving behind a crisp stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. Caleb had spent the early hours chopping wood, his back to the cabin, his focus on the task before him. The air was sharp, the sun weak against the cold, and the only sound was the rhythmic thud of the axe hitting the logs. Sarah sat on the porch, wrapped in a woolen blanket, watching Caleb work. Her hands, still stiff from the days she had spent in the cage, were beginning to regain some strength, but she still felt like a stranger in her own body. The warmth of the cabin and the steady comfort of the McCraw family were healing her in ways she hadn't thought possible, but the fear, that gnawing sense of unease, wouldn't leave. She had tried to push it down, to bury it beneath the surface, but it was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. Every time the wind howled, every time the door creaked, she feared it, the feeling that her past was still chasing her, always one step behind. The sun was just beginning to rise higher in the sky when the first sound of hooves reached her ears. The sound was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire inside the cabin, but it was there, unmistakable. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her heart raced. Sarah stood quickly, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the horizon. She saw nothing at first, just the snow-covered pines and the long stretch of land leading up to the cabin. But then the sound grew louder, closer. A shadow appeared in the distance, moving at a steady pace, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Caleb heard it too. He stopped mid-swing, his axe raised, and turned his head toward the sound. His expression hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he scanned the road leading up to the cabin. "Stay inside," he called over his shoulder, his voice low, commanding. Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to be hidden away, to feel like a prisoner again, even if it was for her own safety. But Caleb's tone left no room for argument. "I'll be fine," he said, giving her a reassuring glance before turning back to the road. The sound of the horse's hooves grew louder now, accompanied by the jangle of metal saddlebags, spurs, the clink of a rifle. Sarah's hands clenched around the blanket, her fingers trembling. She couldn't stay inside. Not now. Not when the past was knocking at her door. She took a step toward the door, but Caleb was already there, his hand on the latch. "Sarah, please." His voice was softer now, but still firm. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "I can't." Sarah whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I can't hide anymore." Caleb hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, as if weighing the consequences of letting her face whatever was coming. Finally, he gave a small nod and stepped aside. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing. The rider was getting closer. She could see the outline of the man, now his dark coat, a stark contrast against the white of the snow. His face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but there was no mistaking the silhouette, the build, the way he sat tall in the saddle. It was him, Liam Ross. The man who had come to collect her. The man who had been sent by Crenshaw. Her breath hitched, and she instinctively stepped back toward Caleb, who had come to stand beside her on the porch. His hand was resting on the handle of his rifle, his expression grim. Liam's horse slowed as it approached, and the man dismounted with a fluid motion, his boots sinking into the snow as he stepped forward. His eyes locked on Sarah immediately, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You didn't think you could escape him forever, did you?" Liam's voice was as cold as the air around them, his smile twisted with a mix of satisfaction and malice. Sarah swallowed hard, but the words didn't come. She had imagined this moment 100 times, but now that it was here, all she felt was a quiet, suffocating dread, the feeling of being trapped again. "You have no business here." Caleb said, his voice low but steady, like a mountain that would not be moved. "She's under my protection. And if you're smart, you'll leave now before this gets ugly." Liam chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Smart? I'm here on Crenshaw's orders. And you think you can just stop me? You're nothing more than a farmhand, a family man who thinks he's got the right to play sheriff in these hills." Caleb didn't flinch, didn't step back. He stood tall, the rifle now resting against his shoulder, his stance unwavering. "If you're here to take her, you'll have to go through me." Liam's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Caleb, the smirk fading from his lips. "You think I'm here for a fight?" He took a step closer, his hand brushing against the rifle at his side. "This isn't about fighting. This is about taking what's mine." Sarah felt the words cut through her like a blade. She wanted to scream, wanted to say something, but the fear clogged her throat. She had thought she could outrun this, that she could bury it deep enough that it would never come back. But here it was, staring her in the face once more. Caleb shifted his weight, his hand tightening around the rifle, but his eyes never left Liam. "Crenshaw doesn't own anyone, and if he wants a fight, I'll give him one." Liam's smirk returned, this time darker. "This isn't your fight, McCraw. It never was." With that, he turned his attention back to Sarah, his gaze cold, calculating, as if he were appraising a prize he had come to claim. "You don't get to decide who owns you anymore," Liam said softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Crenshaw doesn't forget. He never forgets." And then, before Sarah could react, Liam turned on his heel and started walking back toward his horse. His movements were deliberate, as though he knew the threat he had just left hanging in the air. Caleb didn't lower the rifle. He didn't move at all, not until Liam had mounted his horse and begun to ride away. When he was out of sight, Caleb turned to Sarah, his face tight with the strain of holding back what he really wanted to say. "We'll handle this." He said, his voice firm, but there was something in his eyes, a shadow of doubt. "We're not running from him, Sarah. We're standing our ground." Sarah nodded, her thoughts still swirling like a storm in her mind. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But as the cold wind picked up again, the certainty that had settled over her in the safety of the cabin seemed to fade, and the fear returned. She wasn't free. Not yet. The storm was coming, and this time she wasn't sure if they could survive it. The ice was thick, but it could break at any moment. Sarah's heart raced as they crossed, knowing that crossing this river was more than just a journey. It was the line between freedom and capture. The wind howled across the open land, the bitter cold biting at Sarah's exposed skin as she stood at the edge of the river, staring at the thick ice that stretched across the water. The snow had started falling again, soft flakes swirling around her like whispers of a world that had turned cold and indifferent to her suffering. The air was thick with tension, and though the river appeared frozen solid, Sarah could feel the weight of every passing second pressing down on her, as if the ice itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to crack. Caleb stood beside her, his face set in determination, his eyes scanning the river. He had already checked the ice, tested it in places, but Sarah could still see the flicker of concern in his eyes. This wasn't just another river crossing. This was their last chance to escape. If they didn't make it, if the ice didn't hold, they were trapped. "We're crossing here," Caleb said, his voice steady, but there was a quiet urgency to it. "The ice is thick enough, but we'll need to move quickly." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, a wave of fear crashing over her. She had never crossed a river like this before, never had to make such a choice. But this wasn't just about the river. It was about everything. It was about her past, her freedom, and the dangerous men hunting her down. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, her breath visible in the freezing air. Caleb turned to her, his face softening for a moment. "We don't have a choice," he said. "We'll make it. But we need to stay together. The ice will hold if we move in a line." Sarah nodded, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The fear in her chest grew tightening like a vice. She had spent so long running, surviving, always one step ahead of her past. But now it was here right in front of her. The past she had tried to outrun was catching up, and every choice felt like a line in the sand. If they didn't cross this river, they would be trapped. And if they did, there was no guarantee they would make it to the other side. Caleb's daughters had already gathered near the riverbank, their faces pale with worry, but none of them seemed willing to show fear. Even Maggie, who had been so full of life and curiosity, now stood silent, her small hands clutching the woolen shawl around her shoulders. They all knew what this crossing meant. It wasn't just a river. It was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. "Stay close," Caleb instructed, as he gestured for Sarah to move toward him. He led the way, his boots crunching against the snow as he made his first step onto the ice. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before following him, her steps tentative at first, then more sure as the ice held her weight. The ice creaked underfoot, the sound strange and unsettling, like it was protesting the pressure. But Sarah kept her eyes fixed ahead, focusing on Caleb's steady form as he moved forward. His daughters followed in a line behind them, the weight of the moment settling over them all. Each step was a gamble. Every crack in the ice made Sarah's heart race, but she didn't dare slow down. The cold wind whipped around them, the snow falling faster now, as if nature itself was trying to stop them. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Her mind raced, thoughts tumbling over one another. What if the ice broke? What if they fell into the freezing water? She could barely swim. She had been running for so long, surviving by whatever means necessary, but never had she felt so fragile, so exposed. But then Caleb's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Almost there, he said, his voice steady, and even though she could hear the tension behind it, he didn't show it. Just a little further. They were halfway across now, and the ice seemed to hold firm beneath them, but the cold was getting worse, the wind slicing through their clothes. Sarah glanced back at the cabin, barely visible in the distance, and a wave of regret and longing washed over her. She couldn't go back. She couldn't stay in Miller's Ridge, couldn't go back to the life Crenshaw had planned for her. But leaving crossing this river meant everything was different. The life she had known, the past she had tried so hard to escape, would be left behind. And that scared her more than anything else. "Keep moving," Caleb called back to her, his tone firm. "We're almost there." Sarah nodded, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. Her breath came in short bursts, her chest tight, but she kept moving, placing one foot in front of the other. The ice underfoot groaned again, the sound sharp and unsettling, but it held. The cold was unbearable, the wind cutting through her layers, but they couldn't stop. They had to make it. They had to survive. "Papa, look out!" Maggie's voice was high with alarm, and Sarah turned just in time to see Caleb's footing slip. His foot skidded across the ice, his body jerking sideways as the ice cracked beneath him. A gasp escaped Sarah's throat as she saw him teeter dangerously on the edge of the ice. "Maggie, get back!" Caleb shouted, but it was too late. The ice beneath him gave way, a loud crack echoing through the air. His body plunged toward the water below his arms, flailing his body, crashing through the ice. "Papa." The cry tore through the silence, a sharp, heart-wrenching sound. Before Sarah could move, she was already running toward him. Her heart pounded in her chest, her legs burning with the effort, as she slid across the ice toward Caleb. The water was dark and cold, and she could hear the splashing of his body as he struggled to stay above it. "Caleb!" Sarah cried, her voice desperate as she reached for him. His hand shot up, his fingers grasping the edge of the ice. His face was pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was no time to lose. Sarah's heart raced, and she reached out her hand, trembling as she grabbed his arm. The ice groaned beneath them as she pulled with all her strength, trying to haul him out of the water. Her hands slipped on the slick surface, but she kept pulling, her muscles screaming with the effort. Caleb was too heavy, too soaked with the weight of the water, and for a moment she feared they would both go under. But then, just as her strength was giving out, she felt a pull on her arm. Caleb's daughters had arrived, their eyes wide with fear, but their hands steady. Together they pulled Caleb free, dragging him back onto the solid ice. Breathing heavily, Sarah collapsed beside him, her hands shaking, but the weight in her chest had lightened. Caleb lay on the ice, gasping for air, but alive. They had made it. "We're okay," Sarah whispered to herself, even though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. The fire they started in the hearth wasn't just to keep them warm. It was a symbol of a new life, a new beginning that Caleb was willing to fight for. The cabin was still save for the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. The flames danced in the stone fireplace, sending flickers of warmth through the room. Sarah sat in front of it, her legs tucked beneath her, staring at the fire, as if the flames might hold the answers she was searching for. It had been hours since they crossed the river, and even longer since Caleb had fallen into the freezing water. He had recovered, of course. After a long, drawn-out struggle to get him out of the ice, Caleb had finally managed to regain his footing. They had huddled together for warmth as the girls fetched blankets and made a fire. But now, with Caleb sitting in his chair, dry and warm again, the reality of the danger they were still in loomed larger than ever. The fire, though comforting, felt like it was burning with a new purpose, as if it were meant to remind them of the fragility of their lives now, of the choices they had made. "Are you okay?" Caleb's voice was rough, his eyes soft as he looked across the room at Sarah. He sat by the fire now, a blanket wrapped tightly around his shoulders. His daughters were busy helping each other, tending to small tasks around the room, but there was still an air of unease in the cabin. Caleb's question wasn't just about the physical toll of the crossing. It was about the fear in the air. The past was closing in, and there was no more room to pretend it didn't exist. Sarah met his gaze, the flickering light of the fire casting shadows on her face. The warmth had seeped into her bones, but the cold dread that had settled in her chest still wouldn't leave. I'm fine, she said, though her voice betrayed her. She wasn't fine. She wasn't even close. But she couldn't admit that to Caleb. He had done so much for her for all of them. And if she let the fear win now, if she allowed it to control her, then she would be admitting to herself that this wasn't the escape she had longed for. It was only another form of imprisonment. Caleb studied her for a long moment, his eyes not just looking at her, but seeing her, really seeing her. The kind of look that made her feel exposed, but not in the painful way she was used to. It was as if he saw the scars that had marked her soul, the ones that could never be erased. But he didn't look away. He didn't judge. "Sarah," he said again, his voice low and steady. "We've made it this far, and we'll make it through whatever comes next. Together." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could survive whatever Crenshaw's men might throw at them, but the terror she had lived with for so long wouldn't let her hope fully. What if they couldn't make it? What if she had brought this danger to Caleb's family, his daughters, by just being here? The memory of Liam Ross, his cold eyes and his promise that Crenshaw would never stop chasing her, came rushing back. It felt like the storm wasn't just outside the cabin, but inside her too. "We have to leave," Sarah said abruptly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay here. They'll come. I know they will." Caleb frowned, his face creased with concern. He rose from his chair, moving toward her. "You're wrong," he said softly. "We're not going anywhere. You're not running anymore. You're here with us. And we'll protect you." Sarah shook her head, her hands curling into fists in her lap. "You don't understand. He'll never stop, Crenshaw. He'll destroy everything you've worked for, everything you've built." Her voice cracked as she spoke the words, the raw emotion in them making her chest ache. Caleb sat down next to her, close, but not too close, giving her space while still offering his presence. "I understand more than you think. He's a dangerous man, and I won't let him take you. But that doesn't mean we run. We stand and we fight for what we've started here, what we've built." She looked at him, her heart pounding. He didn't understand, not fully. She had seen Crenshaw's wrath firsthand, seen how he crushed anyone who stood in his way. He wasn't a man who would simply walk away, especially not when it came to something or someone he owned. "I can't put you in danger," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "You and your girls, your family. I can't." Caleb's hand reached out gently, touching her arm. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're part of this family now. You're one of us, and we protect our own." The sincerity in his words hit her harder than anything else. She had never been part of a family like this, never been loved like this. Her entire life had been about surviving, about running and hiding. She had never truly allowed herself to feel safe, to trust anyone enough to let them in. And yet here she was, surrounded by people who had already accepted her, people who saw her not as a burden, but as someone worth fighting for. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney, as the room seemed to shrink around them. And for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to feel something she hadn't let herself feel in years: hope. "I'm scared," she admitted the words, feeling like they had weight. She hadn't said that to anyone in so long, but here with Caleb beside her, it felt almost like a relief to speak it aloud. Caleb didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply sat beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but full of conviction. "I know you are, but we'll face it together every step of the way." Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to believe him for a fleeting moment. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or if Crenshaw's men would come barreling through the door at any given second. But in that moment, She knew she had something she hadn't had in a long time, something she had almost forgotten existed. She had a family. The door to the cabin creaked open, and the warmth of the fire met the cold air, sending a rush of relief through the room. The girls entered laughing quietly as they carried in firewood, their faces glowing with the innocence and energy of youth. "We've got to make more stew," Maggie exclaimed, her arms full of kindling. "It's too cold out there for just one meal." Caleb chuckled, shaking his head, but the light in his eyes was unmistakable. "We'll make more, Maggie. We'll make enough for all of us." The sound of their laughter filled the cabin, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. The weight of the past, the fear of what was to come was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the laughter of a family that had welcomed her without hesitation, Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something she had always longed for. A future. Her future. And she wasn't going to run anymore. The price of survival was higher than Sarah had ever imagined. Every choice carried weight, and with each decision, she could feel the walls of her past closing in. The morning sun was barely above the horizon when Sarah stepped out of the cabin. The snow, still fresh from the night's fall, covered the ground like a thick white blanket stretching endlessly in every direction. She could hear the wind howling in the distance, but here in the hollow where Caleb's cabin sat, it was oddly quiet. The air was still crisp and bitter, the kind of cold that sunk deep into your bones if you weren't careful. It had been 3 days since the river crossing, since Liam Ross had come to threaten them. The memory of his cold, calculating smile still lingered in the back of Sarah's mind. He was a shadow in her thoughts, a reminder of the danger that was always just one step behind her. She took a deep breath, her lungs burning with the sharpness of the mountain air, and started walking toward the riverbank. It wasn't far, just a short distance through the trees, but she needed the space. She needed to be alone for a while to think, to clear her mind. Her heart was still heavy from the confrontation with Liam. Caleb's words kept echoing in her head. "We'll face it together." He had said it with such conviction, such certainty, and for a moment she had allowed herself to believe it. But the fear gnawing at her gut wouldn't go away. Crenshaw wasn't just going to let her walk away, not after everything she had stolen from him. "Sarah, wait up." Sarah turned around at the sound of Maggie's voice. The girl was running toward her, her face flushed from the cold, her breath coming out in visible puffs. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her heart skipping a beat at the urgency in Maggie's voice. Maggie stopped in front of her, panting slightly. "Papa says we need to move quickly. We heard some riders up the way. He wants us to pack up." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her first instinct was to turn and run, to disappear into the forest, and keep running until she couldn't hear the sounds of horses or the name Crenshaw. But she couldn't run anymore. Caleb had made it clear that they were going to stand their ground. "Who is it?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though the tremor was unmistakable. "I don't know," Maggie said, her eyes wide with concern. "But Papa thinks they might be looking for you." The ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to shift. Her body froze, her mind racing. It was happening again. The past had found her. She could feel the weight of it closing in, and this time there was no escaping it. No more running, no more hiding. "We need to go," Maggie said, her voice tight. "Papa says we need to get everything ready to move. He's going to need you." Sarah's stomach churned, but she didn't argue. She turned and followed Maggie back toward the cabin, her mind spinning. She wasn't sure what they were running from, whether it was the riders up the way or the very real fear that Crenshaw's men were closing in. Either way, They couldn't afford to wait. By the time they reached the cabin, Caleb was already preparing for what was to come. He was moving with purpose, checking the rifles, making sure the horses were ready to go. His daughters were packing their things, their faces drawn tight with the fear they weren't sure how to voice. "We've got to move," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. He turned to Sarah, his eyes searching hers for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps trust. "Are you ready?" Sarah nodded, though her heart felt like it might shatter in her chest. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fight them." "You don't have to fight them alone," Caleb said, stepping closer. His hand brushed against her arm, a silent promise. "We'll stand together." It should have comforted her. It should have made her feel like she could face whatever was coming. But instead, the words felt too heavy. She wasn't sure she could live up to his promise. She wasn't sure they could stand against Crenshaw's men. The door to the cabin creaked open, and Evelyn stepped inside carrying a bundle of blankets. "Papa, the horses are ready," she said, her voice steady, though Sarah could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Caleb nodded and turned toward the door. "We leave in 10 minutes. Get your things together." Sarah felt the knot in her stomach tighten. It was happening. They were going to leave everything behind again. She made her way to the small table in the corner of the cabin where she had left her few belongings. There wasn't much to pack, just the clothes she had managed to take with her from Miller's Ridge. A few personal items she had salvaged in her flight from Crenshaw. She quickly gathered what she could, stuffing them into a cloth bag, and turned to Caleb, who was now standing in the doorway. "We'll be ready to move," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We'll get through this, Sarah. We're stronger together." But Sarah wasn't sure. The fear was choking her, suffocating her, and no matter how much Caleb tried to assure her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running towards something even worse than the danger they were trying to escape. The wind outside picked up, the howling intensifying, and the first flakes of snow began to fall again, swirling through the air. It was as if nature itself was preparing for a storm that would change everything. Caleb's voice brought her back to the present. "We need to move now. Get the girls ready." Sarah nodded, and they gathered their things. The cabin, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a cage. The door slammed shut behind them as they left the chill of the mountain air biting at their exposed skin. They were on the move again. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way toward the horses, the sound almost deafening in the stillness of the morning. Caleb was the first to mount, his daughters following suit, their faces resolute, but the fear was still there, lurking in the shadows. Sarah hesitated for a moment before she climbed onto the horse behind Caleb. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't speak. There were no words to say, no promises that could be made. The past was here, and they couldn't outrun it. The sound of hooves echoed through the trees, each step taking them further from the cabin and closer to an uncertain future. The wind howled around them, but it wasn't the storm that scared Sarah. It was the feeling that they were racing against something that was always one step ahead of them, and she didn't know if they could survive it. The guns had fired, but in that moment, as the smoke cleared, it wasn't just survival that mattered. It was the family they had built together. The night was colder than usual, the air thick with a biting wind that cut through every crack in the cabin. Sarah sat near the fire, staring into the flames, but her mind was far from the warmth. She could hear Caleb moving about the cabin, his heavy boots crunching on the wooden floorboards, his movements sharp but slow. The tension in the air had been building ever since they left the river, since they'd seen Liam Ross leave with his threat hanging over them. The fire crackled, but Sarah couldn't focus on the warmth. Her mind kept returning to the same thought: Crenshaw wasn't going to stop. He would send more men. He would make sure that this family, this new life she had found, wasn't hers to keep. She clenched her hands in her lap, her nails biting into her palms. It was like the cage she had been in before, but now the bars were invisible. Now it was the fear of what was coming, of what she couldn't outrun, that held her in place. Sarah Caleb's voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. He stood in front of her, his gaze searching her face as he crouched down, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to make it through this, I swear." She met his eyes, but there was a coldness inside her that she couldn't explain. He was trying to reassure her, trying to give her something to hold on to. But there was something in the way the wind howled outside, in the way the silence had settled between them, that made it hard to believe. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. "I know you're scared," Caleb said quietly, his voice softening. "But we're stronger than this. You've already made it through so much. We'll keep fighting." The words were supposed to be comforting, but they only made her feel smaller, more fragile. How much more could she fight? How much longer could they keep running? "I'm not just scared." Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "I'm not just scared for me. I'm scared for all of you. For your girls." Caleb's eyes softened, and for the briefest moment, he looked as though the weight of her words had struck him too. He dropped his hand from her shoulder and stood looking out the small window of the cabin where the snow had started to fall again, the flakes large and slow against the night sky. "They've taken enough from you," he said after a long silence, his voice steady. "I'm not letting them take anything more. Not if I can stop it." Sarah watched him, her heart twisting at the certainty in his voice. He was a man of honor, a man who believed in protecting the people he loved. But she couldn't help but wonder if that belief would be enough to keep them safe from Crenshaw. The door to the cabin creaked, the wind howling outside as it slipped through the cracks in the wood. Caleb stiffened, and Sarah felt her chest tighten with the weight of their uncertain future. "Papa," came the soft voice of Alice from the other room. Caleb turned to face the door, his face softening as he stood and walked toward it. "You should be in bed, Alice," he said, his voice gentle, but there was an edge to it now. "I heard something," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "Outside." The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood up, and before she could stop herself, she was on her feet, moving toward the door, her heart pounding. Caleb didn't say anything, but his eyes met hers for a moment, his expression hardening. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice low. "Stay here." Sarah watched him move toward the door, his boots heavy on the wood. She wanted to stop him, wanted to tell him to be careful, to not go out there, but she knew it would do no good. Caleb was a man of action. He couldn't sit idle while his family was at risk. The door opened with a creak, and the cold air rushed in, making Sarah flinch. She didn't follow Caleb outside. She stayed in the warmth of the cabin, but every instinct in her screamed that something was wrong. She stood there motionless, waiting, listening. The moments stretched, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, without warning, the sound of a shot rang out sharp and loud, cutting through the night. Sarah's heart stopped, and before she could think, she was running toward the door. "Caleb," she cried, her voice cracking as she threw open the door. But Caleb wasn't standing in the doorway. He was outside, and Sarah could see him now, crouched low, his rifle raised. He was pointing it toward a shadow in the distance. His eyes were sharp, his expression cold and focused. "Stay back," he shouted to Sarah, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Get inside." But Sarah didn't listen. She couldn't. Her legs were moving before her mind could catch up, and by the time she reached Caleb's side, she could see the figure that had triggered the shot. It was a man tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "I don't know who you are," Caleb said, his voice low but firm, "but you'd better get the hell off my land." The man didn't speak. He only raised his hand, signaling to someone further back in the shadows. The air seemed to grow colder, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "I'll give you one chance to leave," Caleb continued, his rifle still aimed steady. But then the wind shifted, and Sarah heard the distinct sound of more riders approaching from the other direction. She turned her head to look, her stomach sinking, as a group of men on horseback emerged from the shadows, their figures cloaked by the falling snow. Liam Ross was among them, his grin visible even from where Sarah stood. "We've got you now." Liam called, his voice loud enough to carry. "There's nowhere to run." The cold settled deeper into Sarah's bones, and for the first time she understood the weight of Caleb's words. There was no escaping Crenshaw. Caleb's rifle didn't waver. "I'm not going anywhere." And neither is she. The snow continued to fall, each flake heavier than the last, as the riders drew closer, their horses' hooves crunching in unison on the snow. The battle for survival had come to their doorstep. And for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of the decision they had made to fight. To stand. She wasn't sure if they would win, but she knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't go down without a fight. For the first time, Sarah realized that freedom wasn't just about escaping. It was about building something worth protecting. The riders came closer, their horses moving with a steady, rhythmic pace, their breath rising in the cold air like smoke. Liam Ross led them, his figure dark and imposing against the falling snow. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was hard cold, as if he had become a part of the storm itself. Behind him, a group of men moved in line. Each of them armed, their eyes glinting with the same dangerous resolve. Sarah's stomach churned, her breath shallow, as she watched them approach. Caleb didn't flinch. He stood firm, his rifle still steady in his hands, his eyes locked on Liam. His jaw was tight, his body tense, but there was no hesitation in him. The wind whipped around them, cutting through the thin layers of clothing they wore, but Caleb remained unshaken, his resolve like iron. "I'm not leaving," Caleb called to Liam, his voice carrying through the air, with the kind of authority that made Sarah's heart race. "Neither is Sarah. You want her, you'll have to go through me." Liam's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile, though there was no humor in it. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he dismounted from his horse, his boots crunching in the snow as he took a step forward. The other men followed suit, their movements deliberate, each of them circling around Caleb and Sarah, cutting off any chance of escape. "You don't get it, do you?" Liam said, his voice low but venomous. "Crenshaw doesn't leave loose ends. You can fight all you want, but in the end it won't matter. He always gets what he wants." Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened, but his eyes never wavered from Liam. "I said you're not taking her. Not while I'm still standing." Sarah could see the tension between them, the two men facing off like adversaries who had been circling each other for years, both unwilling to back down. But it wasn't just about them. It was about something much larger, something that Sarah had come to realize in the brief time she had spent with Caleb and his family. It was about more than just survival. It was about a life they were trying to build, a life that was worth fighting for. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't just stand by and let this happen. She couldn't let Caleb face these men alone. They had already come this far. She couldn't let them be torn apart by her past. Stepping forward, she made her way toward Caleb, her feet crunching in the snow. The cold air bit at her skin, but her mind was set. She couldn't hide anymore. She had fought for so long just to get to this point, and she wasn't going to let it all fall apart now. Caleb turned to her as she approached, his expression softening just for a moment. "Sarah, stay back," he warned, his voice a low murmur. "This isn't your fight." But Sarah shook her head. "It is my fight, Caleb," she said, her voice steady now even though her heart was still racing. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have a chance. A future. I'm not going to let them take it from us. From all of us." Caleb's eyes searched hers, a flicker of doubt passing through them. But then his jaw tightened, and he nodded, stepping back slightly to make room for her. "Then we fight together." Liam watched the exchange, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can win," he sneered. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. I've fought harder battles than this, and—" Caleb replied, his voice calm but full of authority. "And I'll fight again. As long as I have breath." The wind howled again, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of it filling the space between them. The air was thick with the tension, the crackling of the fire behind them, the only source of warmth in an otherwise frozen world. Sarah felt the weight of the situation press down on her shoulders, but she stood her ground. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something worth protecting. Liam took a step forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice cold and filled with venom. "Crenshaw's not someone you can just stand up to, but if you want to die fighting, I'll give you that." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she stood taller, a newfound strength filling her with resolve. "We're not running. We're not hiding anymore," she said, her voice louder now, filling the space between them. "We're fighting. We'll face whatever comes next. Together." The words came from a place deep inside her, a place she hadn't known existed until now. She had spent so long running, hiding from the past, but in this moment, surrounded by Caleb and his daughters, she realized that this was what it meant to truly live. To fight for what mattered. To fight for the future they could build despite everything that had happened before. Liam's expression shifted, his eyes darkening as he looked at her. For a moment he said nothing, but Sarah could feel the air crackling with the weight of his anger. The other men shifted, ready for a fight, but Caleb stood firm, his rifle still pointed toward Liam, his body like a shield between Sarah and the approaching threat. "You're wasting your time," Liam said, finally, his voice filled with disdain. "But if you're so sure of this, we'll see how long you last." He nodded to the men behind him, and without another word, they began to move. The sound of horses' hooves rang out again, echoing through the silence as they began to circle, preparing for the inevitable standoff. Caleb's eyes never left Liam's, his body tense and ready for whatever came next. "This ends today," Caleb said quietly, his voice full of conviction. And then, without warning, the first shot rang out. The crack of the rifle split the air, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Caleb's rifle fired in response, the two shots ringing out in quick succession. The sound of the battle had begun. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but her mind was clear. She wasn't going to stand by. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She had found something worth fighting for, and she was going to protect it no matter what. The world around her erupted into chaos. Shots rang out, and the sound of galloping hooves filled the air. But Sarah stood firm, her hand gripping Caleb's rifle, her heart steady as she took aim. This wasn't just about survival. This was about family. This was about the future they were building together. And they weren't going to lose it without a fight. For the first time, Sarah realized that freedom wasn't just about escaping. It was about building something worth protecting. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, sharp and jagged like the cracks of thunder in a storm. The wind had picked up howling around the cabin, but the chaos outside drowned out every other noise. Sarah's heart raced, her breath shallow as she stood beside Caleb, her hand gripping the rifle in her fingers. The battle had begun. The men that Crenshaw had sent to claim her, to destroy everything they had fought for, were closing in. Caleb stood tall, his rifle aimed steady, his body ready for the fight that had been thrust upon them. His eyes were hard-focused, but there was a quiet strength in him that Sarah had come to rely on. She wasn't sure she could do this. She wasn't sure she could face down the men who had haunted her for so long. But she had no choice. Her mind raced as she thought of the family inside the cabin, the girls, Caleb's daughters, who had come to mean so much to her in such a short time. They were more than just a family to her now. They were her anchor, her reason for standing and fighting, for not running anymore. "They're coming," Caleb said quietly, his voice low but steady as he turned to face her. His eyes flickered to the window, scanning the horizon. The fire had dimmed the room, feeling colder than it had before, but it wasn't the cold that made Sarah's hands tremble. It was the fear that she had carried for so long, the fear of losing everything she had fought for. "We'll fight together." Caleb added, his voice firm as he reached for her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Stay close." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She was scared. Terrified, in fact. But she couldn't show it. She couldn't let them see the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had to be strong, strong for Caleb, for the girls, and for herself. The door creaked open, and they stepped out into the cold night air. The snow had begun to fall again, soft, heavy flakes that settled over the ground like a blanket. The landscape around them seemed peaceful, untouched by the chaos that was coming. But Sarah knew better than to be fooled by the quiet. The sound of horses' hooves could be heard faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Liam Ross had come to finish what he had started, and Crenshaw's men were closing in fast. Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle, his gaze scanning the tree line. "Stay low," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. He took a step forward, leading the way as they moved through the snow toward the edge of the clearing. Sarah stayed close behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if they could win this fight. She didn't know if they could stop Crenshaw, but she had no choice but to try. For Caleb, for the girls, for the life they had built here away from the past. The riders emerged from the tree line, their horses moving in formation, their dark figures cutting through the falling snow. They had come for Sarah, for her freedom, and they weren't going to stop until they had her. Caleb raised his rifle, his stance steady. "Don't move until I say." He murmured, his voice a calm command. Sarah nodded her hand, gripping the rifle tightly. Her eyes locked onto the riders, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment, and she knew this was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. The first rider slowed his horse, his eyes scanning the clearing. Sarah could see the faint glint of his rifle, his hand resting on it, like he knew what was about to happen. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire yet. He was waiting for the right moment, the perfect shot. The seconds stretched on each one, feeling like an eternity. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the coldness of the air biting at her skin. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide. But she couldn't. Not anymore. And then, with a suddenness that startled her, Caleb fired. The shot rang out through the clearing, loud and sharp, and the first rider fell from his horse, the sound of his body hitting the snow echoing through the night. The others moved quickly, their rifles raised, but Caleb was already moving again, firing another shot, then another. Each shot was precise, each one finding its mark. The men tried to return fire, but Caleb was too quick, too focused. The riders scattered, trying to regroup, but Caleb's aim never faltered. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she took her first shot. She had never fired a gun before, not like this. But she aimed and pulled the trigger, her hands shaking, her breath tight. The shot rang out, and she felt a strange sense of satisfaction as the rider she had aimed at fell from his horse. She didn't know if she had killed him, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had fought back. The battle raged on, shots echoing in the night, the sound of the rifles filling the air. Caleb moved with a deadly calm, his movements fluid as he reloaded and fired again. The girls had stayed inside, but Sarah could hear their voices, their prayers, their soft cries of fear. She couldn't let them down. She couldn't let them see her falter. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the shooting stopped. The riders who were left retreated, their horses turning, their bodies pressed low against their mounts as they fled into the night. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, the sound of the wind filling the space where the chaos had been. Caleb lowered his rifle, his breath heavy but controlled. He turned to Sarah, his eyes scanning her face. "Are you all right?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure if she was all right. She wasn't sure if she would ever be all right again. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something different. A sense of purpose. A sense of strength. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something worth protecting. The door to the cabin opened, and the girls stepped out, their faces pale but determined. They had heard the shots. They had heard the battle. And now they were here. Maggie, her eyes wide with concern, ran toward Caleb. "Papa, is it over?" she asked, her voice small but filled with hope. Caleb nodded, his expression softening as he knelt down to her level. "It's over, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with relief. "We're safe." But as Sarah looked out into the distance, her heart heavy, she knew that safety was fleeting. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Crenshaw's men would be back. They would never stop coming for her. But for now, they had survived. And that was enough. Together, they had built something worth protecting. The educational lesson learned from this story is that true freedom does not come from running away from hardship, but from choosing where and with whom you are willing to stand. Even after loss, betrayal, or fear, life can offer a second beginning when courage is paired with community and steady values. The story reminds us that family is not only defined by blood, but by those who show up, protect one another, and refuse to abandon what is right. In later years especially, it teaches that dignity, loyalty, and quiet perseverance still have the power to shape a safe and meaningful future.